start again. What are the top 5 challenges facing sports scientists when returning a player from injury? Hello, I'm Kristian Weaver and welcome to this episode with Jack Clover. Today we're going to be talking about different topics around returning a player from injury when they've been under the care of a sports therapist. So Jack, kick us off by telling us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm currently the head of sports science for the women's team at Everton Football Club. So I've been at Everton for about 4 years now. Previous to that, I worked at Liverpool John Moores University. So I worked with various different sports, female and male sports, mainly younger athletes. And previous to that, I interned a little bit in professional cricket as well. So that's kind of my sporting background, quite a variety, but obviously currently working in women's football, primarily with the first teams, but also overseeing some of the academy teams, sports science and strength and conditioning provision as well.
Excellent. So I imagine that there are a variety of different challenges which sort of go in between different sports and working between male and female athletes. So can you just tell us about the different challenges of working within women's football?
Yeah, so I think there's some unique challenges working with both female and male athletes. As I said, I've got a bit of experience in both. Mostly in football has been pretty much just with female athletes. I think one thing I always notice about working with females is they ask a lot of questions. They want to know a lot about the programs that you're giving them. They're quite keen to kind of know the reasons why you're doing what you're doing, which certainly poses a challenge and keeps you on your toes. I think as well with the female game compared to the male game, talking about football specifically, I think there's a lot of similarities. Obviously the structure and setup of the game is identical. In terms of the physiological demands, running distances covered over a match is very similar, but I think in the men's game there's obviously a lot more explosive movement. They hit a lot higher speeds. I think in the female game, there's probably unique challenges as well. It's probably slightly more technical, maybe a little bit less time with the ball in the air, a little bit less aerial duels, etc. So maybe slightly less physical in that way. Although I think certainly in the time I've worked in professional women's football, the physicality of the game has really grown over the last few years, which certainly poses a unique challenge. I think specifically as well from a sports therapy point of view, the injury profiles are quite different. Maybe slightly less muscular injuries, more structural, more ligament tendon injuries. Obviously, a greater risk of ACL in female sport as well.
Yeah, great. And then also, obviously, working in women's sport, it's changed over probably the last 5 years, and definitely over the last 10 years. And we see in the men's game, obviously, changes within how people play the sport and the number of high-speed repetition sprints they have to do. Have you seen similar changes in how the game has adapted over that time?
Yeah, without a doubt. As I said, I started at Everton about 4 years ago. At the time, it was a semi-professional club. It was a second-tier club. The players a lot of them were working or studying during the day, training in the evening 2 or 3 times a week. Whereas now, the whole top division of the female game is full-time professional. I think obviously we collect data around GPS, physical data in the gym as well, and you just see those numbers going up and up and up at the moment. So certainly massive increases in the physical demands of the game over the last 3 or 4 years.
And do you still have female players working on semi-professional contracts and some on professional contracts? And how do you sort of manage that two type of player?
Yeah, so we've kind of gone through the transition of it, which I suppose was a unique challenge in itself, kind of transitioning players from part-time footballers to full-time footballers. I think the entire top division now is full-time professional, so all our players are full-time contracts. So to give you an idea of like a typical schedule, we'll train 5 or 6 days a week out on the pitch in the morning and in the gym in the afternoon, and obviously play at weekend. So yeah, I think there's still probably that unique challenge in the second tier of the women's game, where you've got players on semi-professional contracts and players on professional contracts, which certainly was a change when we were working like that. But yeah, I think probably the greatest challenge for us has been making that jump to that full-time schedule, and it's been incredible really to see the progression of some of the players and their physical outputs as a result of that professionalism.
Yeah, great. And obviously you work with the performance side of things, but also sometimes you have responsibility to return that player back from injury. So what are your top challenges for returning a player from injury?
So for me, with my process, obviously coming at it from a sports science strength and conditioning point of view, so initially you might not have a massive input in the kind of acute management of an injury, but as part of my process, I always try and understand the injury and understand maybe some of the reasons behind it. That's not always an easy task. There's usually a lot of factors that go into the cause of an injury, but I think like you should always be looking at learning from that injury and what might have caused it, and obviously finding out as much as you can about the injury itself. I think as well, it's really important to build relationships and build trust with the player themselves as well. So manage their expectations, have a good plan in place, and know the stages of that rehabilitation process, even if the actual sports scientist input comes in a little bit later down that process. You need to understand the whole process and the stages of that. I think these days as well now there's a massive influence of data within professional sport, and that's another thing that's changed over the last 2 or 3 years. We've really had a lot more input from data, and we have a lot more data available to us. For me, as part of my philosophy, I really like to set some objective measures and benchmarks for players returning to injury, so they can see each of those stages and they can tick off each of those benchmarks as they get to them. And then probably the greatest challenge for me as a sports scientist is that end stage rehab, working with the sports therapist, working with the physiotherapist, and actually integrating a player back into team training. And I think that's a real unique challenge as well, around managing coaches' expectations, having the relationships with the coach to put players in certain drills, find ways of manipulating drills to suit a player coming back from injury, and also definitely managing that player once they are back in full training. I think at times you can have an issue with a coach thinking a player's back from an injury, therefore they're training, therefore they're fully fit. So managing that load once they're back in training, making sure they're building the appropriate strength qualities off the pitch as well, to ensure that once they're back from injury, they're not making those same mistakes again that maybe led to the injury in the first place.
Yeah, great. So there's some really important points to pick out there. So understanding the injury and the mechanism or the cause of injury, sort of adapting what the players' expectations are and how they return back to their sport, planning out those rehab stages, probably with the athlete involved in some capacity to make decisions about that. Also looking at the data which you're getting from the player and how to actually interpret that data. We just had a podcast with Liam Hayes, and he was talking about the data which they gain from Train My Athlete and how they can use that to influence the decision making essentially. But also it depends upon what you see in front of you as a practitioner, and you need to sort of take both components of that, and then how we then get them to integrate back into their team training. So there's some really good points there, Jack. Thanks for that. In terms of, you spoke a little bit of the integration between the team. What advice would you have for any sports therapists who are working part of a multidisciplinary team with sports scientists and strength and conditioning coaches?
I think my first kind of piece of advice would be to build those relationships within the MDT. I think that's key. regardless of what sport, what context you're working in. Build relationships. I think the relationship between a sports therapist and a sports scientist is really key in end stage return to play rehabilitation. And it's probably the most important relationship. I think if you've got that trust between you, it's well planned, well structured, and you're delivering consistent messages to the player. I think that's almost like half the battle. I think as well, there needs to be that understanding of the sports scientist's role and what they're trying to do, because obviously that sports science and strength and conditioning is a massive part of sports therapy. The two kind of go hand in hand. So I need to have an understanding of what's going on in the acute phase in that early stage rehab, so I can then implement the correct messages during end stage rehab. And obviously that works the other way around as well. It's certainly not a case, in my opinion, of once a player ticks a certain amount of boxes, they're out on the pitch with the sports scientist, and that's kind of the last the sports therapist sees of them. I think it's a much more gradual approach, and that also, I would say, is the same once the player's back out on the pitch, even once they're playing. The sports therapist still needs to have an involvement in managing that re-injury risk as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I think you give quite a unique perspective on how you sort of incorporate sports therapists and physiotherapists into the work that you do in order to make the best environment for the players as well. If listeners were going to try and find out more about you, then where could they go?
So I'm not the biggest poster on social media. I tend to use Twitter more for kind of reading other things and following other people. I do occasionally retweet the odd post that I find interesting. And I also use Instagram, so I'm more than happy to be messaged on either of those platforms or LinkedIn. And also more than happy for people to contact me via email. I'm always happy to speak to young coaches, therapists, S&C coaches. I'm more than happy to answer questions.
Great. So on Instagram, it's strength_coach Jack. And then on Twitter, it's Jack_Clover1. So if anyone does want to reach out to you there, then they obviously can get in touch with you. So Jack, thanks for coming on the podcast. I'll make sure that all your contact details are in the show notes. And I'm sure that we'll get you into the sports therapy community in the future to try and field some questions from our members as well. So thank you very much for your time. I know you're a busy man, so I'll let you get back to what you're doing.
Thanks very much. Great to talk.